Well, the 100-member Constitutional Convention is due to meet for the first time this month to consider a number of proposed changes to Bunmach na hÉireann. Over the coming weeks, we're going to look at those proposals, and we begin this morning with blasphemy. You may remember the controversy that arose 3 years ago when the then Minister for Justice, Dermot Ahern, introduced a law defining blasphemy and setting a €25,000 fine for those found to be guilty of publishing or uttering blasphemous matter. Well, that law will become obsolete if blasphemy as a punishable offence is removed from our constitution. But in the year 2012, in a modern democracy, does it really matter at all? Well, here to examine what this might mean in a practical sense, I'm joined from our Cork studio by Dr Oliver Scharbrodt, who lectures in religious studies at UCC, and with me here in studio is Michael Nugent of Atheist Ireland. You're both very welcome. Michael, first of all, you came back to a lot of prominence in 2009 about your campaign over Dermot Ahern's law. Why do you disagree so much with there being deterrents against blasphemy in our constitution and on our statute books?
Well, the first thing is that blasphemy laws don't actually protect religious beliefs. That's what they claim they do, but it doesn't. What it does is it incentivises outrage, because the first test of blasphemy in this law is that people express outrage about it, and we know how easy it is for certain religious communities to be tempted to express outrage. We should be discouraging that. The second is that it protects religious beliefs but doesn't protect non-religious beliefs in the same way, which is against the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that Ireland has signed up to. You're not allowed to discriminate in favour of religious beliefs over non-religious beliefs. And the third thing, of course, is that we should really be removing these 1930s Ireland references from our constitution rather than legislating to protect them.
But I suppose the law that was brought in here, one of the things I think you feel is that although it's never actually been used in our courts, it has been cited in cases internationally.
It has. And first of all, but in terms of here, it hasn't been used here, but we never thought when the abortion referendum came in that it would be used to take an injunction against a raped teenager. And the difficulty with these kind of theological laws is you never know when somebody's going to decide that their conscience is telling them that they have to implement it. Internationally, what we found at international conferences is that we're kind of desensitised here to this. We kind of go, sure, that's just Fianna Fáil passing mad laws again. But internationally, people are just astonished that a modern pluralist Western democracy is passing a new blasphemy law in the 21st century. Now, at the United Nations, the Islamic states, led by Pakistan, have been citing the wording of the Irish blasphemy law as what they want implemented internationally. Now, in Pakistan, you've currently a case where a teenager is charged with blasphemy, and it's been and the imam who initially made the complaint has now been arrested for allegedly framing her and tearing pieces of the Quran. Is that the Rim Shah Masih case? Exactly, yeah. And there's another case in Pakistan, a woman called Asia Bibi, who's facing execution for essentially what was a personal grudge that ended up being played out through blasphemy laws. There's a guy in Indonesia called Alexander An, a civil servant who is jailed for blasphemy for writing on Facebook that God doesn't exist. In Indonesia, the constitutionality of their blasphemy law was challenged recently, and the Irish law was cited in support of that. And one other case that is very significant internationally is a guy called Sanal Edamariku, who is the head of the Indian Rationalist Association, who is being charged with blasphemy in India at the moment for revealing that a supposedly crying statue of Jesus was actually faulty plumbing and capillary action. But the significance there is that he's facing blasphemy charges based on complaints by the Catholic Church, not Muslims, but by the Catholic Church in India. OK, let me bring in Dr Scharbrodt there from Cork. Thanks for joining us. I know you're an academic with an area of expertise in Islam. First of all, I know the Irish Islamic community welcomed the 2010 Defamation Act, which included this law on blasphemy. Explain to us why some Muslims feel a certain degree of protection with having laws prohibiting blasphemy.
Well, I think it's very important to make a distinction here between statements made by representatives of Muslim organisations in Ireland and, I suppose, what the actual average Muslim in Ireland would think. Within a Catholic context, for example, we are very much aware that statements made by members of the clerical hierarchy do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the majority of Catholics in Ireland. I think similar dynamics also play a role within Muslim communities in Ireland. So I would say for most Muslims, this issue is perhaps not something that occupies their hearts and minds 24/7. I suppose why certain representatives of Muslim organizations support it is, they might feel that the blasphemy law protects them against Islamophobic attacks or Islamophobic discourse that has obviously risen in the last few years in Western Europe. It hasn't been so much an issue in Ireland, but obviously we have seen in other Western European countries from far-right politicians, far-right political parties, statements in the discourse that makes offensive statements against Muslims, that, makes generalized statements against Muslims, that, puts them under sort of general suspicion. And I suppose, those representatives of Muslim organizations that have supported it, they might feel that the blasphemy law protects them against such discourse. In my view, they are probably mistaken. I think the existing legal framework, the Incitement of Hatred Act and so on, probably provides sufficient protection. But I think they might feel that this is sort of an additional layer of protection that might help them to ward off, potentially Islamophobic discourse in Ireland.
And I suppose taking it to an extreme, Oliver, even Anne-Marie Horan was writing about that case. Michael was talking about this morning, the Rim Shamasi case. And also earlier this year, a mentally disturbed Muslim man in the centre of Pakistan was accused of blasphemy. He was arrested. Yes. And a crowd of like 2,000 then stormed the police station, dragged him out and beat him to death and then burned him alive. I mean, I suppose the problem is something that can appear reasonable here can be used in a very extreme way somewhere else.
Yes, I suppose. I mean, I think, we are very much aware in a Christian context, and certainly in the Irish context, that if there's a sort of a religious conflict, if there's a conflict between religious communities, it is not just about religion. I mean, there's a whole political context, and there are sort of extremists on either side who exploit a particular situation, who are interested in escalating a political situation or conflict in order to gain political capital. And I think, there's something similar that we can observe here. I mean, when we look at discourse on blasphemy in Islamic law, in Islamic jurisprudence, what is the response, or what should be the response of Muslims to a potentially blasphemous act? It's very important to emphasize that there's a whole range of views among Muslim legal scholars. Those saying that obviously, they all agree it's something terribly bad to do, and, the person will be punished in the afterlife and so on. But, there's, voices who would say, both in history and in contemporary context, that there shouldn't be any punishment, that, the person will be judged by God and so on. It's not up to people to respond to that. And, of course, you have other views, both historically and in the contemporary context, that say such an act is so serious that it requires the capital punishment. What, however, is important to recognize, and this shows that in these particular situations that we've seen in Pakistan, for example, it's not really about the protection of religion, because even the harshest interpretation, those legal scholars that would say if somebody offends the Prophet Muhammad or offends God or offends Islam, needs to be punished by death, they would recognize if the person is a minor, if the person is ignorant about what he or she is doing, if the person is mentally ill, the person cannot be punished. So not only do these groups, in a sense, arbitrarily choose the harshest interpretations that exist within the whole range of Islamic jurisprudence, but they even omit half of these harshest interpretations by persecuting people who even, the most fundamental scholars say, well, they're not liable because they don't know what they're doing.
OK, Michael, you want to come back?
Yeah, I think there's a very important distinction between protecting religious people as individuals from being injured or hurt on the one hand, and protecting Islam or religion itself from criticism. It should be perfectly valid to criticise religion without inciting injury against religious people. And the blasphemy laws internationally, they don't protect Muslims. I mean, there's a Muslim called Hamza Kashgari who's currently in jail in Saudi Arabia for tweeting that if he met Muhammad he would shake his hands as an equal. So it doesn't protect Muslims, it protects criticism of religion. And the only way that society evolves is by being able to criticise ideas as opposed to injuring people.
There's a big reaction to this, actually, and just two of the examples. Blasphemy should be kept. If we have people like the Pussy Riots going into churches and dancing on altars, there should be a law to punish it. That's from Robert in Kilkenny. Also, it should be my absolute right, one guy says, to say God doesn't exist and that religions are a load of delusional rubbish. Racism against Muslims or whoever is a different issue. Let me ask you something in Cork, Oliver. If the proposal to take blasphemy out of the Constitution was adopted and if the current law so was rendered obsolete, do you think Irish Muslims would feel threatened?
No, as I said, I don't think, it is an issue that particularly occupies, Muslims in Ireland. I mean, again, some Muslims might feel that it offers additional protection, but I would agree with Mr. Nugent that it really doesn't do that. I think for most Muslims in Ireland, who take their religion very seriously, obviously there's a whole range of Muslims there, Muslims who are very religious, but also there are many Muslims in Ireland who are more or less secular. It's not necessarily, Islam is not necessarily, the central element in their lives. But for those Muslims in Ireland who are devout, who take their religion seriously, I think what they're looking for is that, they want to live in a society, in a context where, their religion is respected, where they can enjoy freedom of religion, where, if you like, the different institutions, the different sectors of the society, the educational system, the employment sector, and so on, make accommodations to allow for the expression of beliefs, for their religious practices. I think, these issues, that they're not discriminated against as Muslims and so on. I think these issues are, much more important, much more central to Muslims in Ireland who take their religion seriously. And again, I think if they believe that the blasphemy law would protect them against such discrimination, they're mistaken. It serves a different purpose and it's certainly outdated. But I think what is important for Muslims in Ireland who are religious is that their religion is taken seriously and that they are in an environment where their needs are sort of recognised and accommodations are made.
I think the most significant thing about this is not actually anything to do with Muslims or Islam or Christianity. It's to do with the fact that our politicians are afraid to do the right thing. This law, like things like the fact that the president has to swear a religious oath, these are anachronisms that come from the 1930s, and our politicians should be prepared to change them. But you
want a secular Ireland, to be honest, Michael, and there are plenty of people even listening who might not want that.
Yeah, but there are plenty of religious people who would also want a secular Ireland in terms of not believing that the president should have to swear a religious oath. Secularism is not the same thing as atheism. Religious states protect religion, atheist states protect atheism, and secular states protect both, protect the right of anybody to believe whatever they want to believe.
But presumably, Michael, you'd still accept that there's a need for protection against incitement to religious hatred.
Yeah, well, we have that already. We have laws against religious hatred. And in fact, the Irish Attorney General's office in the run-up to this law said that those laws were satisfactory in terms of protecting the genuine concerns of religious people from incitement to hatred.
Dr Scharbrodt, if this was, one of a series of steps towards making Ireland a more secular society, would that make Muslims in Ireland feel uncomfortable or not?
Well, I suppose, there are obviously, I suppose, different types of secularism. And, if we look, for example, at France, the type of secularism that has been established there, I suppose many French Muslims feel that they have been excluded and they have been discriminated against. And I suppose, yes, there are certainly Muslims would say that the kind of Catholic ethos that has existed in the Irish public has made it easier for them to articulate their particular religious needs, to gain recognition for their particular religious needs. And I suppose that's true to a certain extent. However, I think it is a kind of a double-edged sword in a sense. It's a bit ambivalent because on the one hand, the Catholic ethos, there's a certain, as some people say, respect for religion in Irish society as a consequence. But obviously there is a certain dominance of Catholicism in the public and the sort of notion that, the normal Irish person is, white, Catholic, heterosexual, married and so on. And people who fall out of the scheme, whether they're Muslims, whether they're Hindus, whether they're atheists, agnostics and so on, they're sort of, out of the norm and they're sort of marginalized. So I think, the kind of Catholic heritage has been an ambivalent experience for Muslims. It has allowed for a certain articulation of their religious needs, but also it sets Catholicism as the sort of normality and marginalize all those people who don't quite fit into the frame, which includes all sorts of minorities.
Yeah, I think the most significant minority there, by the way, is non-religious people.
Yes, exactly.
Because what happens is when religions are in charge of a particular country, it's their particular religion that they believe is important. But when religions start to be a little bit under pressure, they'll start gathering together and saying, well, it's faith that's important, and then it is the non-religious people that are marginalised.
I suppose, Dr Scharbrodt, as well, most of our common law was based on the UK, just across the water. That was a 17th century law we followed in 2008. The Brits got rid of it. Isn't it slightly anachronistic, maybe? People might say that we still have it.
No, I completely agree. I mean, it doesn't fit into sort of a modern democratic society, and I think it doesn't serve any particular purpose. So, yes, I mean, I would certainly say, it's unnecessary. I mean, I'm myself an academic in the study of religions, working on Islam. So, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, I mean, is the bread and butter of my profession. And in terms of the questions I ask in my research, in teaching, I don't want to be stifled in any way, or don't want to live under the impression that I can't ask certain questions because it might be potentially offensive to Muslims or followers of other religions. Yes, I think it's slightly anachronistic, and there's really no purpose for that in a country, in a modern democratic country in the 21st century.
But the significant thing there, by the way, is a lot of these campaigns that, say, 20, 30 years ago would have been about trying to change public opinion. I think now it's about recognising that public opinion has already changed. We're living in a pluralist, modern, secular society, and that the government needs to catch up with society and change the laws and the constitution to reflect the new Ireland that we're living in today.
Just more reaction from our listeners. I'll give you an example. I'll give you three. First caller says this law should be scrapped immediately as it's not used to protect Muslims but on the contrary to persecute non-Muslims. Wake up before it's too late. That's from Mick. Another one, Jesus put to death for blasphemy. And blasphemy is a law applying to everyone. It's not asked for by or written for the Muslim population. Islamic perspective is really interesting. But what about the huge majority? I mean, I suppose, though, Dr. Oliver, one of the most important things is we need to remember Muslim groups do react, as we've seen, incredibly badly, for instance, to images from Islam being portrayed in what some of us might have seen as a comical way, but they really get very upset.
Yes, but again, I think it's important to recognise, the wider political context. I mean, I suppose we also need to recognise, from a secular perspective that, religious people, any followers of any kind of religion, they will get generally offended if sacred figures are, insulted and so on. And I think that's perhaps a universal feeling. I suppose, when we take the example of the Danish cartoon affair in 2005, I mean, it's a very good example to illustrate, if you like, the political complexities where, obviously, there was a right-wing Danish newspaper that published these cartoons in order to provoke the Muslim population in Denmark to make a point that they haven't integrated, that they haven't found a place in Danish society. And then we have, if you like, Muslim leaders jockeying for authority in Denmark, exploiting this particular issue in order to gain political capital. I mean, the two countries where we've seen the largest demonstration, the largest responses were, for example, Pakistan and Syria. And I mean, in Pakistan, there are, various Islamic parties, and they don't fare very well in general elections. They get sort of 10-15% of the votes. So obviously, such an issue is an ideal opportunity for them to mobilize their followers and to gain, an international audience. And I think similar, we've seen in 2005, we saw in 2005 the strongest demonstrations in Syria. And the reason for that was that the regime supported these demonstrations because, I mean, we know now how volatile these autocratic regimes have been in the Middle East. And for the Syrian regime, this was a perfect opportunity to sort of to underscore its Islamic credentials. We defend the interests of Islam. And to allow...
It's more significant that is that those weren't spontaneous demonstrations of outrage by people. I mean, it's inconceivable to think that all of the Muslim residents of the Middle East suddenly went home to their inexhaustible supply of Danish flags to bring them out and burn.
Yes.
These were politically motivated, organised attempts to influence international opinion in favour of militant Islam.
And one should also recognise that there were peaceful demonstrations. I mean, there was a peaceful demonstration in Dublin, And there were also sort of peaceful means to protest against it. I mean, I think there was a boycott of Danish dairy products in some Middle Eastern countries. Again, I'm not entirely sure whether it's the most intelligent way to protest against it, but I think there are all sorts of peaceful means used by Muslims to articulate their anger, but unfortunately they were overshadowed by the more violent responses.
Dr Scharbrodt, there's a lot of reaction to this. One from Barry Grant in Waterford City. He makes the point that the wording of the blasphemy legislation is skewed, he believes, towards minority religions. He believes it would be much more difficult for Roman Catholics to make a complaint, as it would be harder for them to produce a relatively substantial number compared to, for example, Muslims, Sikhs, Baha'is or Quakers. Do you think Barry has a fair point there?
Well, I think, historically, obviously, blasphemy laws protected the established church. I mean, in Britain, the blasphemy law just protected the beliefs of the Church of England. And I think in sort of colonial Ireland, that was, similarly the case. So I think, looking at history, it's rather the opposite. It's there to protect, the majority faith community. I don't know. I suppose, the act as such is formulated in such a vague manner. It makes so many exceptions. It says that, statements of an artistic, of an academic, of a scientific value are excluded from prosecution. So I think it will be extremely difficult, actually, to put anyone before court because of, the very vague formulation of this particular law.
Well, as I said, though, we would have thought that it was inconceivable that a raped teenager would have an injunction taken out against her because of the abortion referendum, but that happened. And that's the difficulty. You can't mix theology with secular law, or you end up with these absurdities where people just start bringing their religious beliefs into implementing the law.
Quick final question, Michael. If you're a guessing man, do you think the Constitutional Convention will propose it's removed or not?
Oh, look, it's obviously going to propose its removal, but it's absurd that the government believes that we have to have people discussing it for a year before putting it to the people.
Oliver, what do you think? It'll stay or not?
I think it will disappear. I think that's the natural logic.
Listen, thank you both very much for joining me this morning.